Blood smelled different in the dark, thicker, heavier. Thana curled her hands into fists, then relaxed them. Curl, relax, curl, relax. She ignored the distant sounds of the crowd roaring in the arena, the battle raging within it. She ignored the closer sounds of inexperienced fighters sobbing or begging for mercy, for freedom, offering to do anything, anything at all if they would be allowed to go free, or at least go back to their cell. One man who had survived his first fight kept up an endless refrain of "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." The experienced fighters were like her, quiet save for the sound of their breathing, each of them doing the same thing she was in their own way, settling, spiraling, down, 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 down to the place inside where pain didn't matter, life didn't matter, nothing mattered, nothing at all, only the fight. There was no winning, not in the pits. Fight and survive, or fight and die. Down, 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 seeking the place in her tattered soul where her head finally went silent. The dim light through the cracks around the double doors only hinted at the source of the smell. The smears of blood on the floor from bodies, or what was left of them, being dragged out of the arena. Spatters of blood on the walls from injuries that spurted from squabbles between fighting slaves, from blows struck by the guards to those who fought one last time to avoid going into the light of the arena. Smears, splatters, pools, drips, corpses. Laying somewhere in the darkest shadows of the low-ceilinged tunnel where Thana waited in her cage, thrown together like broken dolls in the back of a cart, to be taken to wherever their owners dumped their lifeless toys. They had their own smell too. Thana rolled her shoulders and let it all wash over her like a breeze. The known factors for her upcoming battle flicked through her mind. Her tattered clothing had not changed, would not be a hindrance. The rope that secured her makeshift skirt around her waist was tied perfectly, not too tight, not too loose. The ragged edges of the skirt brushed her upper thighs. It would not inhibit her movement. Her threadbare chest binding, secure. No loose edges for an opponent to take advantage of. Her hair was the greatest threat. The half-snarled braid of it dangling to her shoulders, but her master liked her with long hair, liked his female slaves to still be feminine, even if they were killers. It made them prettier decorations, prettier bribes, and gifts that way. If she had her way, she would have hacked the whole mess off years ago. Beauty took a back seat to survival. The heavy collar around her neck reminded her that having her way was about as likely as pigs flying out of the overseer's ass. The solid wooden doors to the arena groaned open, spilling sickly yellow light into the tunnel, illuminating the filth and gore. The narrow cages with their waiting occupants. Guards dragged a pair of bodies past her cage into the deep dark where she couldn't watch. A third guard dragged in the lower half of a man. The roars of the arena were deafening, but couldn't quite cover the feral shriek that made every waiting slave, experienced or not, flinch. Dragon. Thana watched as the legs were dragged into the shadows, thick, ropey, entrails trailing, leaving marks in the dusty floor. It threatened to tug her up into her body again, the knowledge of what had done that. A true death sentence, every fighter's greatest fear. She had had her share of nightmares about walking into the arena and finding a dragon chained on the other side, waiting to be freed. She'd seen them in their barely big enough pens, waiting for their turn in the arena. The size of horses with heavy curved claws, nearly as long as her forearm, powerful jaws filled with sharp teeth, and a vicious, cunning glint to their metallic eyes that spoke of a certain level of intelligence, even if that intelligence had been shattered by madness. Other slaves, ones who had been captured later in their lives, sometimes spoke of the world above. Few claimed to have ever seen a dragon up close, but those that had told stories of their feathered bodies gleaming in the sun, their riders proud and capable and dangerous. Thana was inclined to believe them, even though the only dragons she'd seen had dingy broken feathers and barely looked capable of carrying their own weight into the skies, let alone a rider. She knew how slavery in Undal could warp a being into something worse. Down, 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 there. Silence. A guard reached for the door of her cell, keys jangling, then stepped back as he swung the door open on creaky hinges. She barely felt herself move forward, barely noticed as the shackles were released from her wrists. The freedom would have been heady if she cared. The freedom would have been heady if she cared, if it mattered. Her steps were even as she strode for the light, through the door, into the massive stone arena. The heavy wooden doors creaked shut. They called the arenas the pits for a reason, deep in the bowels of Undal, an underground city that more knowledgeable slaves said was a secret haven for the evils of the world. The pits were a temple of violence. The sandy ground was stained by blood, human and creature alike, with a few stubborn boulders that the original architects had either left intentionally or didn't care enough to remove. The walls stretched at least 6 times her height, with a row of downward-facing spikes at the top to dissuade the more violent and acrobatic animals from making an escape. And stretching up into the gloom, tiers and levels of bench seats, packed with a roaring, faceless crowd, with a few elevated boxes for the wealthy and more powerful to enjoy the show. The slaughter. She turned to the right of the door, to the rack of weapons that always rested there, poorly made, beaten, dirty, sharp or deadly enough to kill, but not sharp or deadly enough to make it quick, without skill or luck anyway. Vanna lifted the dual short swords, testing them, familiar, comforting in their solidity. The leather-wrapped hilts were still damp with sweat or blood from an earlier wielder, a complication, but not a major one. Not enough to make her reach for a less preferred weapon. She was small and she needed all the advantage she could get. Conquering larger opponents made her popular enough with the crowds to make feeding her to the dragons unappealing. She hoped, thought, wondered. She turned. Fuck. She knew the man striding out onto the sands, owned by a different master, a rival to hers, a skilled warrior, and massive. She'd heard of him. Seen him fight a few times, during exhibitions when they all stood in private halls or ballrooms like obedient little murderers, obedient little toys, and watched the fights. Large, powerful, heavy, slow, vicious, so was she. Flashy, more concerned with putting on a show than surviving, earning the love of the crowd and relying on his physicality. Thana angled her head, watching him from that place inside that was so quiet, where kindness and light and mercy had never existed and never would. She'd seen him take a spear through the calf during one exhibition, and the massive mottled scar was visible as he held his thick arms to either side and spun, earning a roar from the crowd. He had a tiny hitch in his step as he finished his spin. Excellent. One of the women, Laura, owned by her master and kept in the same stable as Thana, had once been owned by her opponent's master. He had been kept near the man and had once said in a broken whisper that he liked taking his time with women, making them scared, making them hurt. Thana adjusted her grip on one of the blades. She could return the favor. Thana walked through the long cage that was built into one side of a tunnel, finding her way by her sixth sense of shadows, instead of by sight. The occasional torch was a flickering marker. She didn't need their light, didn't want it. Her hip and shoulder hurt from where she'd been slammed into the ground with grueling force. It didn't matter. Her throat ached and burned from where her opponent had grabbed and squeezed, lifting her feet off the ground moments before. Her steps slowed, stopped. No one walked through the tunnel, and no one should be coming through the cage for a few moments at least. She stared down at hands she could barely see, but didn't need to. Blood slicked up her pale arms to her elbows, spattered her front, her legs. The sand and dust of the arena coated her sweaty skin, and she felt. She leaned her back against the stone wall and fought the scream clawing up her throat. It wouldn't escape. It hadn't since she was small. Her right hand shook. She flexed it as if that would erase the memory. The feel of the blade jamming up under the man's jaw, jarring through the bone of his skull into his brain, the scrape and grind and squelch. He was horrible and evil. He'd liked taking his time with women, liked making them hurt, liked them helpless and afraid. She couldn't fault him for the atrocities he committed in the arena, though. No more than she could fault herself. They were all butchers. Her hand continued to flex. She pulled out his tongue. Her stomach roiled. She hated that. Hated it, hated it, hated it. Hated herself. The audience liked it. The owners liked it. The overseer liked it. Liked it when they were extra vicious, when they took their time. So she pulled his tongue out, thrown it at the crowd. They liked it. Liked the small act of defiance that they interpreted as celebratory bloodlust. Hated herself. Hated them. See what joy or entertainment or fun did they find. Her only real memories were of being a slave, but the older ones who raised her spoke of living, of joy. Thana stood straight when she heard footsteps scuff farther up the tunnel, swallowing it all down. Cold swept through her insides, shadows seeping into her body under her skin, settling in her heart and mind, making everything so much darker, pulling her down to a different place. She started walking back towards the stable, mask of indifference in place. She always remembered their eyes. Brown eyes, blue eyes, hazel eyes, green eyes, black eyes. An elder had once told her that the eyes were the windows to the soul. His had been blue. There were 6 torches in the cavern her master kept his slaves in, and all they really did was turn the pitch black into a sea of silhouettes and vague detail. Cages were scattered across the uneven ground. Their more violent occupants, mere lumps of shadow. Most people were tethered by chains to rings bolted deep in the rock, chains to collars or to the heavy cuffs around their wrists, around their ankles. Some had chains to all 3. Most lay on the ground, exhausted from their day's work of hard labor in the mines, or construction, or the quarry, or other tasks they'd been ordered to. Some stood or paced in circles around their tethers, like dogs on a chain. Thana walked through them, bare feet following the same invisible route she always took through the bodies in darkness. The far wall of the cavern had cells carved into the rock, the rusted bars set solidly into the earth. Only the prized or most dangerous were kept there. She had never been sure which one she was. Perhaps she was both. Her eyes, used to a lifetime spent in the dark, picked out faces and features in the gloom. Amaret, one of the oldest slaves in the stable, lifted her head from her crude wooden bowl and met Thana's gaze, held it, nodded once, and returned to her bowl of watery stew. How many would truly meet her eyes anymore? She remembered Amaret smacking her upside the head once, not because she had stolen a bite of bread from a neighbor, but because Thana had been dumb enough to get caught doing it. An unfamiliar mother pulled her small child closer to her side as Thana hopped up onto a ledge of rock. The man in a cage nearby laughed and laughed and laughed, running his tongue along the bars and tugging at his wild mop of hair. Thana glanced at him as she went by. So many of them laughed before the end. A pair of men bickered over a blanket, their argument hushed but vicious. Thana stumbled, stepping over a chunk of rock, and caught herself with one hand, her fingers brushing against one of their bowls on the ground. She recovered and stalked on as if nothing had happened. A young woman tethered near the cells coughed and looked up as Thana approached. She offered a small smile before her gaze slid over Thana's shoulder to the guards that had followed her from the moment she'd entered the cavern. The smile disappeared, and she hunched into herself, veiling her features in shadow. Clever. The guards liked the ones who smiled. Thana had balked the first time they led her to the cells all those years ago. She'd kicked and fought, biting the ear off of one guard who'd been foolish enough to pick her up, bracing her legs on either side of the door in a desperate final attempt to delay the inevitable. Her body had still been gangly and small. Her head had barely reached the guard's waist. They'd thrown her in with enough force for her to bounce off the wall, the world disappearing in a blinding flash of white. When she'd woken up, the too heavy chain had pulled on her collar, making breathing in some positions difficult, and her body had ached from a beating she didn't remember. Now she stalked through the door, into the near total gloom of the cell, and waited, every muscle screaming with the urge to do what she did best, waiting for the guards to lock the fucking chain in place. A fantasy. To shred the guards like old cloth, bloodshed she wouldn't regret. She would relish. The weight of the chain settled on her collar, pressing uncomfortably against her windpipe, making the already chafed skin flare with pain. The second guard set the bowl and pitcher on the ground inside the bars, then locked the door behind them as they exited. First guard reached down for the girl, gripping her braid and pulling so that her face was angled into the light. Thana drifted to the bars and gripped them with her still bloody hands. The other guard noticed her watching the exchange and thumped the other on the back. He'd leaned down to put his face within inches of the girl's. The girl didn't make a sound. She didn't fight, offered no resistance, was simply pliant and blank, a doll. Good. Most of them hated that. Thana leaned her face against the bars, watching them silently, marking every move, every breath. Let what she would do to them the second she got free show in her eyes, even as a cruel smile twitched across her lips. The guard holding the girl's braid visibly paled and let go, shooting a final glare her direction. The two meandered away towards the entrance. Every now and then, the thump of a boot meeting a body, often followed by a yelp, marked their passage. The girl pulled her legs in tight to her body, gripping the end of her braid as if to protect it. Her filthy shift was so thin that her ribs were visible along the curve of her back. She'd been in the cavern for 2 weeks. The cough suggested time spent in the quarry, probably chipping rocks into gravel. All the little ones started in the mines or the quarry. Unless they were pretty to look at, then they served in the master's homes, which was a different brand of hell, just cleaner. Not that Thana knew from experience. She'd been a mine child, one of the lucky, scrappy few to survive. This girl probably had always worked in the quarry. Thana's lips pursed on a short whistle, making the girl's head jerk in her direction. Thana tossed her the lump of stale bread she'd stolen when she'd stumbled. The girl caught it with impressive speed. Thana stepped back from the bars, ready to retreat into the shadows at the back of the cell. Darkness was comfortable, familiar. She liked to pretend that she didn't exist in the dark. She would imagine that she was just a sentient piece of shadow, watching the world go by. It was nice to pretend she didn't have a body, especially when her body was covered in filth and dust and gore and... "Thank you," the girl whispered, barely audible over the ambient sounds of 100 people chained in a cavern. Thana paused, looked back. The girl hadn't bitten into the bread yet. She just looked, met Thana's eyes. Thana opened her mouth, bulging blue eyes, shocked even as the light faded from them, blood running from both nostrils, from his mouth, over the hilt of her blade, over her fist. She dipped her head in acknowledgement and turned back to the shadows. They call you the Viper." She stopped, waited. "Why?" came the tremulous question. Thana looked back at the girl, who still hadn't eaten the bread, and really looked. Her eyes too big for her face, an aquiline nose, thin chapped lips, cheeks hollow with starvation, skin mottled with bruises and agony, a soft jawline. Not a great beauty by the standards of the master, but Thana had long thought that beauty was a horseshit concept anyway. Physical appearance might have factored into how she planned to kill her opponents as a fighter, but she had been raised a slave and knew better. Physical appearance didn't mean shit. This girl had strength. She could see it in her eyes, despite the thin, bony body, the rattling cough, and the mess of what looked to be light brown or dark blonde hair. Thana leaned her forearms against the bars once more. The girl blinked. "Oh, that's why." Thana's brows twitched upwards. The girl turned the bread over in her hands and gestured vaguely to her face. "The eyes. The stare. It's like a snake, right?" The corner of Thana's mouth curled up into a rusty smile. Gods, how long it had been. The ice in her chest. Her veins thawed slightly. The girl coughed and offered a little smile. "And I'm fast," Thana rasped. The damage to her throat, her vocal cords, had become permanent long ago. She'd been a shit as a child, always yanking against the collar, picking a fight she'd never been able to win. Her time fighting in the pits hadn't helped. Thana waved a bloody hand towards her eyes. "That and the eye thing. That's where the name comes from." The girl gaped at her for a long moment. Then, "I'm Rags." Few slaves had actual names, the ones who were stolen from above when they were older, usually. Few slave mothers named the children they bore in Undal. Most children weren't wanted. They, like Thana, found their names as they grew, through traits, habits, occupations. Thana had been named by the miners. Not that many still lived to remember the name they'd given her. or that cared to remember, but she did. Dana. Rags blinked. What? My name. It's Dana. Not Viper? No. Dana pushed away from the bars. Eat your bread. Dana woke already halfway to her feet, barely registering that it was the clanging of her cell door that had woken her. The acrid smell of torches burned her nose, and the glare scorched her eyes. It wasn't often that her cell was illuminated by torchlight. In fact, the only time she could remember an actual torch being brought into her cell had been the time she'd been delirious with fever after a battle wound had gotten infected, and her master had deemed her valuable enough to warrant at least some level of care. The thick scar on her side still ached sometimes. Her sensitive, shadow-trained eyes watered at the brightness of the torch's flames. She knew the feel of the craggy, rough-hewn stone walls, the crack on the left wall along the floor, big enough to fit a toddler, that she assumed led into a subterranean tunnel based on the creatures who emerged from it with some regularity. The little pile of dead rats next to the tunnel she'd caught, killed, and left as an offering for the underground creatures she'd never been stupid enough to mention to anyone else. It was different to see her cell in full illumination. She took in the details from the corner of her eye, keeping her focus on the trio of guards whose features were obscured by the light of the torch. Damp streaks oozing from cracks in the walls, the source of the lazy dripping she always heard. The guards were heavily armed, not the usual stable guards. These were closer to the overseer's men. Tall, broad. She'd killed men like them before. The little pile of dead rats was gone. The faint marks on the floor confirmed her suspicion about which creature had snapped them up. Torches moved throughout the cavern. Voices of guards, male and female alike, echoed, accompanied by the clanks of chains, the murmur of confusion that rippled through the slaves. Deep in the recesses of crack on the wall, barely noticeable just above the ground, the torchlight glinted off of eyes. This one, the guard holding the torch said. Another started forward, only to freeze in place when she slid her gaze to him, cataloging factors, details, weaknesses. How she would kill him, even with the fucking chain yanking at her neck. A blade slid along her throat above the collar, the metal frigid against her skin, the point dug in just enough. Not enough to draw blood, but enough. She allowed herself to be unchained without a fight, even if her blood simmered. Outside of the cell, she was pulled to a halt and stood while two chains were fastened to the loops on opposite sides of her collar and held by a guard on each side who stayed well outside her reach if she yanked in either direction. The cuffs on her wrists were clipped together, further restricting her killing ability, but not eliminating it. She was almost flattered. Rags was awake, sitting up and curled into a ball, staring over her knees with wide, terrified eyes. Brown eyes, Nana could see in the torchlight. Those eyes met hers. Dipped to take in the chains, the guards flared with emotion. Nana had a sneaking suspicion as to what was going on. She'd never been taken to a fight this way, not even the private ones the masters held in their great halls and homes. She only remembered the second time she'd been sold with any clarity. The first time, only flickers, sparks of memory from a time when she'd been barely more than a toddler. Fear of the looming, unknown, cold and poisonous, warmed through her belly. A guard jabbed at her back with something, likely the butt of his spear. Swallowing against the ice in her chest, she took a step forward, taking one last look at the girl, who'd been more of a friend in 5 minutes than she'd had in years. Rags's eyes glimmered with tears, and despite the guards, despite the bright lighting, the girl, who looked younger than Thana, had originally thawed, raised a trembling hand and touched her forehead with her fingertips, then dropped them to touch over her heart and lifted them away. It was often the only acknowledgement that the slaves could give to one another. Touching the forehead meant remembrance, respect, the heart, honor, affection. Most people just touched their foreheads. The heart was a gesture reserved for great honor or great love. Thana had never been worthy of either of those things. It almost made her stumble. With her hands bound, she couldn't return the gesture. She dipped her head and eyes to the girl as she went by, the only respect she could give without invoking the wrath of the guards. Rags, the girl with such strength. The other slaves shrank back out of their way as they marched across the cavern towards the double doors that sat wide open. Silhouettes of selected slaves and their accompanying guards moved into the light. Thana heard the whispers as she went past. A few people made sounds of distress. She knew those sounds, knew those people. She'd grown up in this cavern, been raised by the people in it, those who still lived and those who had gone beyond. Many of them remembered that. The man in a cage that had passed murmured her name, or that they passed murmured her name. They were about the same age. She remembered him. They called him Slash. She'd broken his nose combat training once. He'd thrown her by her hair into a pillar. She'd sat pressed against him when his mother died, and he'd wept silent tears. As children, he'd held her hand when she'd been feverish from a goblin bite she'd gotten in the mines that had become infected. Emirates scowled at anyone and everyone who went by, and Thana was no different, but the old woman still raised her fingertips to her forehead, glaring the whole time. Cranky old bitch. Thana would miss her. Sorrow flashed over Laura's face, hands smoothing over her heavily pregnant belly as she sat awkwardly on the ground. She, too, touched her fingers to her forehead. Thana stepped over the line, on the ground where shadow crossed into light from the doors, and clenched her fist to hide the tremor in her hands. As she stepped over the threshold, someone in the cavern called out, "Viper!" She limited her flinch to a blink. Thana. Her name was Thana. And she knew, as she and the other selected slaves were led towards the tunnels that led up to Undal, the city proper, that she was going to be sold. Okay, guys, that was written by a wonderful TikTok creator called See Ya Later, who I will actually put the username of in the description for this video. So if you would like to, please go follow that woman, because she's absolutely amazing and has amazingly funny content. And this writing is some of the best fantasy work, some of the best new fantasy work I've read in years, honestly. So go give her a follow, guys.